who argued that essentially Pashikanis, he's talking all about the relations of exchange, commodity exchange. But of course, in Capital, and in Marx's whole conception of capitalism and how it works, the mode of production of capitalism is constructed not just through relations of exchange, but crucially, of course, of relationships of production. In other words, he's saying that people like Balanza said, well, fair enough, you might have a formal equality of relationships of exchange between commodity owners. But when it comes to that crucial element of capitalism, where exploitation takes place and so on and so forth, that actually Pashikanis does not explain how that can work. In other words, how do we go from, if you like, that to explain the coercive nature of capitalism? And my argument would simply be this: that even though Marx in some ways talks about the relationship of production being an expression of the dictatorship of capital, that is certainly true, but it doesn't appear in that way. The fact is that the control by employers over employees is again mediated through law. Your employer, particularly in the modern neoliberal world, does not simply come to you and say, I'm cutting your wages, I'm going to change your conditions just because I say so. They will point to a contract, they will point to their legal rights as owners or as managers of capital and your legal responsibilities as a worker and so on and so forth. So even that relationship is mediated through law and on the basis, again, of a form of commodity exchange. In other words, you have sold your labour power to the employer in return for a wage. A further criticism that is made, again by Goulantzas, based on that notion, but on others as well, is that Pashikanis, okay, he explained how things work at a private level, at the level of private law, but we still haven't gotten to how we can explain how the state works and how we have public law. Now, Pashikanis actually, in his book on the general theory of law and Marxism, does devote a chapter to the question of the state. And his argument essentially is that what you had when you have the beginnings of, if you like, early mercantile capitalism, of market town, people coming to market, of itinerant traders going from town to town, selling their wares, that of course what happened in those circumstances was that you would have conflicts between those traders. You would need also to protect the property rights of those traders who were moving from town to town, who might be at the whim of bandits and others and so on and so forth, who might steal their property. And therefore what began to arise in these market towns was a form of mediation between the rights of different, if you like, commodity owners in these markets. And so in Pashikanis writes that authority, which had previously been very much a private authority vested in the king, for example, or that of the church, it took on a hue which had hitherto been alien to it. It went public. Okay? So we move from, if you like, direct class power to actually the king or the church and so forth, or the local state, beginning to administer power as, and if you like, adjudicating rights based on the fact that they were, if you like, independent and above the various private individuals. So where in pre-capitalist societies, the antithesis between public and private law is obliterated, there is no clear dividing line between law as objective norm and law as legal power. In modern society and capitalism, the opposition of individual and man as a member of a political grouping is completely absent. And I would suggest to you that if you wanted to pick a particular moment at which such a process took place, if you consider 1789, the French Revolution, that people arrived in Paris as members of an estate. That is, they arrived as members of a socially recognized grouping with specific interests that were, if you like, different from or separate from the interests of other groups, other estates, classes, and so on within society. And that they left Paris instead as, if you like, individual citizens. If you like, they were no longer bound together by organic social or economically shared interests, but had become, if you like, egoistic individuals bearing individual rights under law. So essentially that is if you like, how Pashukhanis sketches out a theory of how the state would grow out of private law, as something existing above the competing classes or above, if you like, individual legal subjects mediating between them. Nonetheless, I think it is true that as some, including people like Piotr Stuczka, who was one of Pashukhanis' colleagues in the 1920s in Russia, that I think Pashukhanis still does, his theory of the state is underdeveloped. It's nothing, he never really pursued it beyond what he wrote in this relatively brief chapter in his book. But nonetheless, I do think the commodity form theory does serve, can serve as the basis for constructing such a relationship. And I will come back to that question a bit later. But I think we still have a problem, and this goes back a little bit to Polanski's critique, when trying to address the undoubted coercive and violent nature of the capitalist state. In other words, even if we say, okay, we can construct a theory of the state and, if you like, mediating between these various actors within the market, of course, we can point to many examples under capitalism, on a daily basis, in forms of policing and so on and so forth, but even in dramatic events, military coups, fascist takeovers, and so on and so forth, where the state actually intervened quite clearly with coercive and violent measures. And I think, excuse me, this points up a crucial weakness in Pashukhanis' work. Excuse me, I think this pulls up a particular weakness in Pashukhanis' work. And in particular, there's a footnote in his book where he says the following. He says, in times of heightened revolutionary struggle, we can observe how the official machinery of the bourgeois state apparatus retires into the background as compared with the volunteer corps of the fascists and others. This further substantiates the fact that when the balance of society is upset, it seeks salvation not in the creation of a power standing above society, but in the maximal harnessing of all forces in the classes in conflict. Now, while I think there's some truth to this footnote, I think the problem is that it undermines his whole theory. In other words, what he's trying to say is, on the one hand, law, the notion of equivalence, the notion of mediating between legal subjects, and that this informs ideology, but it also reflects the material relationships that are inherent to capitalism. That somehow, at moments of crisis, the state, and for that matter, subordinate groups, simply, if you like, set aside law, simply say, okay, the crisis is such an extent, we are leaving that aside and we enter into, if you like, a form of pure political conflict. And yet, if law is founded not purely on the basis of ideology that can come here and there, but actually rooted in material reality, there's a missing step there. How does that happen? And here I think the real issue is, and the real problem with Pashukhanis' theory, is that by focusing on the function of law in the process of exchange, he gives a brilliant exposition of the relation between capital and law during periods of the normal functioning of the capitalist state and of the economy. But what he misses completely is the effect on the function of law when this system goes into acute crisis. Now, I should say in passing, I think this is a very odd weakness in his theory, given that he's writing in 1924. Because, of course, capitalism was far from operating at a normal state of equilibrium. You had the Russian Revolution. You had near revolutions in Hungary, in Germany. You'd had a proto-fascist push in Germany. You had fascism in Italy, and so on and so forth. In other words, the classical model of the constitutional capitalist state was being picked apart, both from the revolutionary left and from the fascist right. Now, one writer on Pashukhanis, Michael Head, has suggested that perhaps Pashukhanis was disorientated by the zigzags in Soviet Russia from the prognosis of Lenin that there would be the withering away of the state to very quickly war communism and the incipient sort of dictatorship. Then you have the remarketization of the economy through the new economic policy, and so on. In other words, that he was sort of disoriented by the situation. But what is certain is that I think this gap, or this weakness in Pashukanis' theory, leaves unexplained what I think has become the defining feature of the 20th century and even into the 21st century. Namely, that the growth in the use of states of exception to justify the suspension of the rule of law, to paradoxically save the rule of law. And here I want to move from Pashukanis to discuss really the work of Giorgio Agamben, who I think some of his work can complement what Pashukanis has to say in this respect. Now, as I said, Pashukanis wrote his book in 1924. In 1921, Walter Benjamin wrote his Critique of Violence, in which he actually addressed the whole question of the notion of law and how law in a crisis seems to move from, if you like, a constitutive form of law to maintaining, to sort of law-preserving violence, essentially violence oscillating different forms of law. And that ultimately the only way of breaking out of law is through what he termed divine violence, which I take him to mean as a sort of revolutionary violence that would destroy the state and, for that matter, destroy law. The next year you have Carl Schmitt's Political Theology, which opens with the famous statement that sovereign is he who decides the state, state of exception. And of course Giorgio Agamben's work, the contemporary Italian philosopher, draws heavily on these relatively unworked out insights, I think, from Benjamin and from Schmitt, to develop his theory, which he explains as being that the state of exception appears as the legal form of what cannot have legal form. And I think there's been a lot of, I think there's a lot of ambiguity in Agamben about what he means by this, and I think also a lot of misunderstanding by commentators on what Agamben means by this, but I'm going to try and briefly explain. Agamben begins with the idea of the camp, if you think classically of the concentration camp, as representing the apogee of biopolitics. It is the place where the power to, in Foucault's words, to make live and let die, appears in its purest form. The logic of the camp has, over the course of the 20th century, Agamben argues, moved from the extremities of power to becoming the norm. Now, the end game of the strategy of biopolitics, as Foucault describes it, is the preservation of the health and welfare of the population. And of course, this requires a sense in which the state must identify a category of those against whom society must be defended, those people who would threaten the health and the welfare of society as a whole. And as we know, Foucault identified this in various ways, talking about people who are mentally ill, people who are sexually or criminally deviant, and so on. Agamben, however, suggests a legal form for this outsider, which he calls, or which he borrows from archaic Roman law, known as the homo sacer, which just literally means sacred man. And what Agamben takes from this is that the homo sacer appeared to be a legal category in ancient Rome of a person who could be killed with impunity. There was, if you like, no legal protection over this image. And in setting up this image of this framework of the camp as a space or a zone that is both inside and outside of the law, he says basically this is the space in which the homo sacer finds himself or herself, in which the law is suspended, normal rights vanish, and the camp inmate, that is the homo sacer, is made the subject of naked and unmediated power. Now this may suggest, well, there's a suspension of the law, sometimes Agamben talks about it as there's the abandonment of law. But I don't think that's quite what's going on here. Agamben himself uses as a prime example the experience of the Jews and others who were sent to the extermination camps under the Nazis. And commonly people think this was an example of pure lawlessness, of pure brutality and violence. But that wasn't exactly the case. For every single Jew in Germany first had to go through a formal legal process of being denationalized, of having their citizenship, their German citizenship, stripped away from them. And the question is, why? Why would the Nazis go through this process? Why bother if it was simply about naked, unmediated power? And my argument is, and I think what Agamben is getting at here, is that what appears to be, and I go back to that original quote, that appears as the legal form of what cannot have a legal form. In other words, the state of exception is both law and it is not law. Okay? By which I mean that the camp, inside the camp, the law is apparently suspended, but of course the camp itself is constituted by and is in relation to law in two ways. First of all, and most obviously, law defines what are the criteria for who is made the homo sacer, who is sent to the camps. Okay? And of course, as we know, for example, in Germany, where we had a very complex system, the Nuremberg laws, which very precisely identified who would go to the camps and who wouldn't. Of course, the physical and juridical boundaries of the camp, therefore, are set by law as well. But as Foucault has suggested, and I think Agamben makes explicit, the rule of law is also functionally dependent on the existence of the camp. And this goes back to Schmidt's comment about sovereign is he who decides on the state of exception. In other words, ultimately, if you were to go back and back and back to the origins of law, to the foundation of sovereignty, in other words, ultimately there has to be a decision maker, that is the state and so on, and then ultimately the state of exception, if you like, is a necessary part of how the state operates and how it, if you like, perpetuates its law and its form of rule. And I think that both Foucault and Agamben sort of grapple towards is the notion that the rule of law is a mechanism for exploitation and oppression, inevitably brings forth resistance to it, which in turn requires the state of exception to stabilize and protect the rule of law. In other words, even though we seem to be almost or semi-permanently in states of exception, where the law has been suspended, actually we keep coming back to the law again and again and again. Now, I think there are problems with Agamben, mainly with his historiography. I think the idea that you can take a legal concept, which is the homo sacer, which is very ambiguous, the evidence for it is very thin, and to suggest somehow, as he does, that it exists almost continuously for the last, whatever, 3,000 years, is simply a denial or of some of the, a denial of the realities of what has happened in history. And various people have commented, and I think it's right, is that for Agamben, if you read Agamben, it's almost like the French Revolution never happened. The decline of the church never happened. The rise and fall of the Roman Empire almost never happened. You just have these legal or political concepts that have just sort of maintained themselves throughout all these massive epochal changes. I think tied with that is, in a philosophical sense, is Agamben's almost extreme idealism. In other words, that everything seems to be about the role of ideas and how ideas have maintained themselves or have changed throughout history without any conception of how those ideas relate in any way to material reality. So in a sense, this brings me back to Pashukanis. And I think, as I said before, I think Pashukanis, and these really are sort of my concluding comments, that Pashukanis, I think, gives a convincing starting point for understanding the centrality of law in effectively transmitting capitalist ideology through its form, which is homologous to the form of relation of capital. And therefore, we can understand the very specificity of the notion of the rule of law and why it has become hegemonic in the way it has in this particular social epoch, that is the epoch of capitalism. However, as I said, I think there is a crucial weakness or something that is really not developed in Pashukanis, which is the notion of how, if you like, in periods of crisis, when the equilibrium that he founds his whole theory on seems to go into a profound crisis. And I think from the standpoint of the early 21st century, it is now clear, I think, that in late capitalism, economic and political crises are now actually the norm rather than the exception. And therefore, it doesn't really explain how law retains its poise and effectiveness as transmitter of ideology and as a social bond in such circumstances. Unless, of course, I think if we begin to interrogate and perhaps adapt some of Agamben's diagnosis of the state of exception as the norm, but as embedded within law as an important supplement to Patrick-Harness's theory. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that if you start from the notion of law as being the whole idea of equal rights, of bearers of rights, and so on and so forth, being grounded in material reality, therefore it's not something that predates capitalism, and it's something that explains the hegemony of law. Equally, I think when you look at the state of exception, what you find is that particularly in the neoliberal state, is again and again that state of exception is presented as a way of preserving law, of preserving rights. It is very noticeable, particularly in the post-9/11 situation, how again and again the suspension of this legal right to trial or other legal protection is always framed as balancing the rights of terrorists and so on and so forth against the right of everyone else to right to life, to the right of society to function. And that's where the security paradigm comes through. So essentially what I'm trying to argue is that, if you like, law is able to maintain its hegemony, its sense of, if you like, it's matching to the material reality people feel as subject of commodity exchange, even in states of exception, precisely because that legal form remains. And if you like, what I'm trying to say, if you imagine an axis in society running horizontally and vertically, I would say that the legal form is, if you like, the legal subject is at the center of that. In other words, it is mediating relationships both between people, if you like, horizontally in society as subjects of commodity exchange, but also as well mediating relationships, if you like, vertically between, if you like, capitalists, bosses, employers, and workers, but also between the state and citizens. And in that way, no matter it seems how disoriented or disruptive the various crises we are finding in society, we keep coming back to law and the notion of the rule of law as creating the stability of the capitalist order. And really, my concluding comment is simply this, that I think in the current period, I think it's therefore all the more important, if you accept what I'm saying, that we need to really interrogate and really begin to develop critiques of law, both theoretically, but I think also at a practical level. I see around me, as a political activist, people still having illusions in the notion of things like human rights, or refugee rights, or things of this sort, as if somehow this will help liberate us. But ultimately, I think that notion of, if you like, politics or liberation as rights or as law will only end up bringing us more back and back and back into the structures of capitalist ideology and capitalist relations. But I'll finish there.
Thank you, Simon. And now I'm giving the word to Tarık Koçi, and he will be talking about dreams and nightmares of liberal international law.
Thank you. I'm just working on my timing. Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's lovely to be here. It's very lovely to be in this wonderful building and to be able to speak in this wonderful building. It's very nice to be in Turkey. I've never been here before, so thank you for your hospitality. Okay, so the title, Dreams and Nightmares of Liberal International Law. What I'm going to present to you today is a little bit of a book that I'm working on currently. Maybe it'll be out in December, maybe it'll be published in January. And part of what I'm trying to do in this work is to outline a relationship between modern liberalism, international law, and the specific problem of war, social violence, terror. And what I try to do in this work is to sketch an outline, an architecture, a particular form or structure of what I'll call liberal international law. So a form of international law which has grown out of a political and legal tradition of modern liberalism. And the argument of the book is an argument against liberalism. It's an argument to say that the liberal dream of international law doesn't lead to the Kantian dream of perpetual peace, or peaceful social global relations, but leads to an endless nightmare of violence, chaos, terror, a nightmarish scenario. Okay, so why is this important? In one sense, it's important arguing against a dominant liberal legal discourse. And I think there's two aspects of this dominant liberal legal discourse which are still present today. The first is what we might call liberal optimism. So the idea of liberal optimism in international law, in international politics, in international relations literature. In the 1990s, there was this big liberal moment of optimism. The end of the Cold War, the kind of grand statements by people like Francis Fukuyama that capitalism had won, that liberal capitalism had won. There was an optimism amongst political theorists and legal theorists that if a system of liberal international law could be fiddled with or adjusted slightly and could be extended across the earth, then the earth would share in this grand cosmopolitan dream of peace, productivity, progress, and everyone would be happy. So this liberal optimism idea of a global rule of law was shared by contemporary Kantians, John Rawls, who passed away, Jürgen Habermas, and David Held, the now disgraced David Held. Now, this liberal optimism has faded amongst liberals. It's faded broadly after 9/11, the attacks on the World Trade Center in 9/11, the American invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, the American invasion and occupation of Iraq, the war on terror. So what we've had is the world's largest liberal capitalist state engaging in an ignoring of international law, massive forms of brutal violence and occupation, and this has shattered in part this liberal optimism. What I think is the response of contemporary liberals is to draw back from this optimistic movement and move to a pragmatism, a moral pragmatism. And this moral pragmatism amongst contemporary liberals is to say, well, forget about the violence of the past. Don't worry about the violence of the war on terror. Don't worry about American exceptionalism, because what's most important is this moral urge to save humanity in every single moment. So moral pragmatism moves us away from a historic register, moves us away from a critical register, and tries to get us to think purely at a level of some kind of emotional urging to a pretend humanity which international law and major Western states think we're meant to save. And I think both of these forms of liberal discourse, the optimist and the moral pragmatist, help to suspend critique and help us not to think about history. So the point of this book, this little book, is just to present an outline of international law its relation to global capital accumulation, and to sketch a history. It's not a grand history, it's just a little history. It's a little architecture. It's fractured, it's broken, it has faults, but I think it gives some kind of way of thinking about the relationship between law, violence, and capital accumulation. So, what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to sketch a little bit of the architecture of liberal international law. And then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to problematize it or raise some questions or problems within contemporary accounts. So hopefully I'll get there. Hopefully I won't bore you in the process. Okay? Okay, so my argument is that contemporary liberal international law and its historical development can be described by an architecture which has three dominant parts. I think of these as a relationship, as a constellation. So the first is a tradition of liberal natural rights, or natural rights thinking. The second is a process of what I'm terming socially antagonistic capital accumulation. To make the point that capital accumulation is always socially antagonistic. And the third is state hegemony. I think these interrelate, they lock together, and they develop historically together. So the first part, natural rights. I think it's generally well established within literature and intellectual history that the conceptual structure, so the basic ideas of modern liberalism, are built upon the natural rights tradition. So the traditions of natural law and natural rights, which run from as early as the 12th century in the Common Era, and become intensified, become written more strongly in the 16th, the 17th, and the 18th centuries of the Common Era. So the basic elements of natural rights thinking involve arguments for liberty, for autonomy and conscience, and arguments for private property. And natural rights thinkers from Vittoria, Francisco de Vittoria, but predominantly thinkers like Hugo Grotius, John Locke, and Kant, focus on these three elements: individual liberty, autonomy of conscience, and private property, to justify a theory of the state. And so the function of the state then is to secure these natural rights, to provide order, to provide security for these natural rights. The second aspect of natural rights thinking is a big historical assumption. And this is an assumption which I think starts with Grotius, is picked up by Adam Smith, and is developed by Kant. This is an assumption about unsocial sociability. So unsocial sociability. The argument that a combination of self-interest, private property, and free trade will lead to progress, will lead to economic prosperity, will lead to peace. So this is a key argument of Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, that self-interest leads to progress, leads to forms of exchange, leads to the generation of wealth, and possibly leads to peace. It's extended by Kant It's there in a protoform in Grotius. Now this assumption is teleological, and we should be skeptical of it. Now the third aspect of natural rights thinking, which now connects it to international law, is to think about these natural rights thinkers like Grotius, like Vittoria before him, like Kant, were also writing a theory of international rights which was universal, which was cosmopolitan. And what they do is take a theory of natural rights related to the state and extend it to the international. They do so by treating states as moral individuals. So Kant can write something like the little work on perpetual peace, and it looks like a Hobbesian social contract, but at an interstate level. And if we look at Kant's perpetual peace, and then we look at the UN Charter, the Charter of the United Nations, then we have the same conceptual structure. So the first argument is that the natural rights tradition is the conceptual structure of modern international law, which has been universalized. The second part of the architecture, socially antagonistic capital accumulation. So the argument is that natural rights aren't just these things floating around in the air, but they are a particular ideological form of capital accumulation within the development of global capitalism. So they emerge out of a long period of transition from feudalism to capitalism in Europe, connected within a modern world system. So this account is not new. It was outlined in part by Pashikanus. It's there in parts of Marx, in early Marx, on the Jewish question. It's there in later Marx and Capital. It's there in the British intellectual historian C.B. Macpherson. What I want to emphasize is that when we talk about capital accumulation, we must emphasize its ongoing violence. So, as an economic relation, it is inherently violent and coercive. The coercion occurs through commodification of wage labour, it occurs through alienation, and it occurs through the generation of inequality. So, this is a standard position in classic Marxist accounts. Marx and Engels of the Communist Manifesto link the question of capital accumulation to social antagonism to violence. Communist Manifesto, capitalism, the development of capitalism leads to symmetrical and asymmetrical class conflict, leads to violence, possibly to class war. In Lenin, a clash between capitalist states or capitalist empires, a clash over resources, conflicts over securing markets, leads to interstate war. What I think we need to reject, in the same way as that we reject the teleology of liberal thought that runs from, in Smith, private interest, to progress, to prosperity, to peace, we have to reject any teleology in Marxist thought that links capital to social conflict to some kind of historical outcome. So critical thinking has to be skeptical of both thoughts, both teleologies, and I think the bulk of critical theory in the latter half of the 20th century does that kind of work, or does that kind of skepticism. Okay, the third part of this architecture then is state hegemony. So we have natural rights, we have an emerging system or a global system of capital accumulation which is coercive, even coercive at micro levels and at class levels and at interstate levels. That's coercion in a Foucauldian sense in terms of factory discipline as well. And the third part is state hegemony. And the argument is that there is a particular political form of the modern state which helps to drive modern capital accumulation. That we can't take the state out of our equation. We have to keep the state in there. And one way of doing this is to look at historical sociology, either people like Michael Mann or people like Immanuel Wallerstein, the world systems theorist, which shows how capitalist states operate as, Mann's terminology, as a leading edge of power, as driving and shaping capital accumulation globally, or attempting to do so. So under world systems theory of Immanuel Wallerstein, then we have leading capitalist states attempting to shape, order, control the development and structure of a modern capitalist world system. For Wallerstein, picks out three hegemonic states historically. The Dutch in the 1600s, mid-1600s, the British in the mid-19th century, mid to late 19th century, and the USA from, say, 1945 to maybe 1973. In each of these accounts, what's important also is the national caging of capitalist classes. So the way in which capitalist classes are caged fall into their own forms of nationalism, and national interest then also works against a general capital interest. And so we have nationally caged capitalist classes then driving aspects of global capital accumulation. So the account, and this is only an overview, the account then is that the architecture of liberal international law, that which shows why there is perpetual violence, why there is perpetual war, operates through the interrelation or the constellation of these three aspects: natural rights thinking, socially antagonistic capital accumulation, and state hegemony. So we have states jostling for position, for predominance within a global world system. We have, at the point of a breakdown of state hegemony, we have states jostling for that hegemonic position. We have national capitalist classes sometimes working together, sometimes in an antagonistic relationship with them. So the antagonism of the economic realm is transferred into the political realm of the state and the interstate system. And the interstate system, through war, through violence, through a language of just war and a language of natural rights, is attempting to justify modes of accumulation through the political form, through war. Okay, so that's the architecture. What I want to do is draw out some questions, some issues related to this architecture and related to contemporary left critique of international law, of global politics, of international relations. And so this architecture I've sketched, it's a sketch, it's an outline. You know? And for me, most importantly, it's a teaching tool. because I think the first role of a critical theorist is to your students and to give them something to read which is accessible to them and which makes sense. Okay. So what I want to talk about now is some questions of more specifically of the legal form in relation to this architecture and in relation to a more general form of critique. Okay. So the first one. Today, within readings, a lot of contemporary readings of international law rely heavily on Paschakanus. And they rely on the work of Paschakanus and his account of the commodity form to condemn the natural rights tradition and to treat natural rights and international law purely as ideological expressions of the commodity form. I think in many ways this account is problematic. And what it does, particularly in terms of intellectual history, is that it jumps too quickly over large parts of the natural rights tradition which contain moments of resistance, moments of questioning, moments of contestation of commodification. So we can't throw the whole of the natural rights tradition out. If we do, we lose a whole discourse, a whole language which questions commodification. So one example of where this takes place is the questioning of the relationship between property, power, and importantly, human dignity. And this takes place in and around the Franciscan poverty disputes